Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event. Last Wednesday, our chapel here at St Mary's was bathed in red light. We joined many other churches and public buildings in the UK and globally in marking #Red Wednesday, to, in the words of the campaign, break the silence about the persecution of Christians and indeed those of faith around the world. The organisation behind Red Wednesday, as many of you will know, is called Aid to the Church in Need, and tonight we're honoured to welcome its, can I still say new national director?
How about young?
Yeah, of course. Young, vibrant national director, Caroline Hull. And Caroline is going to address us this evening on the subject of Christians in the Arab world. Caroline has a distinguished career in the service of the church after an undergraduate degree from Princeton and then a PhD in the history of art from Yale with a specialization, I think, in 14th century medieval manuscripts, so extremely sound person. She worked for Lancaster Cathedral as an assistant to the dean for a decade before joining ACN as its first Northwest manager in 2014. 2019, she became ACN's head of community outreach for England and Wales, and then took on the role as national director earlier this year, following on from the legendary Neville Kirk-Smith. Caroline and her colleagues at ACN are committed to supporting suffering and persecuted Christians all over the world and work every day to break the silence, to give a voice to those whose cries for help are not now being heard. Each year they fund over 5,000 projects in more than 140 countries around the world, helping to support the church in its mission and bringing hope and solidarity to millions of people. They support key church leaders, from priests to catechists, seminarians to sisters, and in doing so enable pastoral and spiritual support to Christians in parishes and communities around the world. So from the building of churches to providing copies of children's Bibles, their projects range from the very big to the small and cover a whole range of ideas to help to nurture the faith of persecuted and suffering Christians. So we focus tonight on the situation in one part of our world, and it's with great pleasure that we welcome Caroline to St Mary's University and ask her to address us on Christians in the Arab world. Caroline.
Thank you. Thank you all very much, and thanks so much for inviting me to speak to you all this evening. During this talk, I plan to look at the current situations for Christians in the Arab world with an eye towards opening up a discussion about how we might all work together to effect positive changes in the lives of Christians and other minorities in a part of the world where they frequently enjoy or maybe endure an ever-decreasing sphere of influence. This is such a big topic that after a few more general opening remarks, I intend to focus primarily on those countries where Christianity remains a viable sort of player, if you will. Let's see if I got, there we go. There's my first slide. On your left is a picture of Mohammed Faris. He was born in Aleppo in Syria, and he flew to the Mir space station in 1987, making him the first Syrian astronaut and the second Arab astronaut. He took with him, this is a little fun fact, he took a vial of dirt from Aleppo, which was the first dirt from Earth ever brought into space. Don't forget that. But he also took an image of an icon from Sadnaya into space with him. And the background here is in the 7th, 8th century, St. Theodore was asked by the abbess of Sadnaya to go to Jerusalem and get a fine image of the Virgin, which he duly did, and it immediately began performing miracles. And he tried to keep it, apparently, but he had to hand it over in the end. And it's still in the Greek Orthodox monastery of Sadnaya, which is just north of Damascus, and it's venerated by Christians and Muslims alike. And I think it's very telling that that Mohammed Faris took this image with him into space. On the other side of the slide is a lady, I think this is his mother, holding a picture of a boy called Ayman Labib. I tell this story at pretty much every talk I give because I don't want anybody ever to forget this boy. Ayman Labib came from Upper Egypt, a village called Malawi, and in 2011, he was 17 years old, and he was in his Arabic language class, and the teacher began to sort of taunt him. He had, like many Copts have, a tattoo of a cross, which you can opt, you don't have to, but you can opt to get when you're confirmed. And the teacher, who was a Muslim, said, wipe off your cross, and he rolled his sleeves down so as not to offend and all, but he mentioned that he was wearing a crucifix around his neck. At which point, this teacher took this boy, 17-year-old boy, to the front of the class and began to beat him. And he did what I would do, what you would do. He ran out of the classroom down the hall, into the toilets, the boys' toilets, into a cubicle. And, just take a minute. How's he feeling? He's in there, he's being beaten on, his heart is pounding, he's scared. And his classmates get up, run down the hallway, tear the door off the cubicle, and beat him more. He then gets dragged into a room where no one can watch, and 2 supervisors at the school continue to beat him, and he died as a result of that. Now, if I can just explain to you what that does to a class of sixth formers. Their whole posture changes. They stop rolling their eyes. Well, sixth formers don't roll eyes, year 9 rolls eyes. But they sit up straight and they are indignant, whatever their faith is. And I don't ever want anybody to forget that boy who didn't get to grow up, who didn't get to do all the things he could have done for no reason other than the fact that his Christian faith was different from the faith of the people who held the power. And these 2 stories together, to my mind, go a long way to shining a light on the complex anomalies that surround the relationship between Christianity and Islam in the Arab world today. I'm no expert on the geopolitics of the Arab world, and I'll admit right now that I'm primarily informed by Christians who are living there. But I am an academic by training, and I do my best to approach complex issues in an open-minded and even-handed way. I fully respect the Islamic faith, its traditions, its legal frameworks, and its political structures. And I don't come at this problem demanding special preferential treatment for Christians in the Arab world, or anywhere else for that matter. But I do feel that we as a global society need to take a stand against persecution and oppression of religious minorities wherever this takes place and whatever the roots of its existence, be it state actors, religious extremism, enforced mass migration, or deeply ingrained religious intolerance. And there is no getting around the fact that Islamic extremism and occasionally hyper-extremism drives a lot of the problems for Christians and religious minorities in the Arab world. So this evening I'd like to present some facts and figures, some regional trends, and some instances of personal witness to help frame the current Christian experience in a way that may help us think of the current problems, which are legion, as perhaps less intractable than they may initially appear to us to be. So first, a brief, I'm going to make this very brief because it was beautifully done for me by the Vice-Chancellor. Just a quick aid to the Church in Need background, just so that you understand what informs my thoughts about Christianity in the countries in and around the Arabian Peninsula, the Middle East, and North and Northeastern Africa. ACN is a pontifical foundation, and we work all over the world wherever the Church is suffering, whether it's poverty, isolation, or persecution. And we work through the Church, so our projects are delivered by bishops, priests, and sisters of all Catholic rites, and though less often, most Orthodox rites. And we receive no financial support from governments, and we rely solely on fundraising raised primarily from our Catholic benefactors. Last year, ACN UK, which punches above its weight, contributed nearly £10 million out of a total of €90 million in aid provided by ACN internationally. And as was mentioned earlier, this funded just over 5,000 projects, and we had a bit of a light year, so it was only 132 countries last year. Most of our work, it was outlined before, so I won't go on about it. I will mention at this point my favorite ACN statistic, which is our mass stipends. We provide millions every year, and last year, every 15 seconds, a mass was celebrated somewhere in the world, and an ACN benefactor had paid the stipend. That's a lot of masses, so that's my favorite one. So we provide all sorts of things. We build churches, subsistence grants for sisters, 1 in every 8 seminarians we fund, but we also provide all manner of transports. Here's some, I think they are Peruvian nuns, and we even bought some horses for them, so whatever it is they need. As well as training catechists, providing Bibles, we are sadly and increasingly having to provide emergency aid, medical help, and trauma counseling to many, many Christians and others as well who are forced to flee their homes or deal with difficult situations as the result of persecution or other armed conflict, or more and more often, actually, natural disasters as well. This isn't strictly our first port of call, so sometimes we do send people to other charities, particularly with natural disasters, but because we're on the ground, we can very often get help in very quickly via things like mass stipends. So certainly with Ukraine, although this isn't a religious conflict, we were able, as soon as we got the SOS from our project partners in Ukraine, to get extra mass stipends and extra subsistence grants in that the sisters and the priests could then use to help the guests that they found themselves hosting. And also, because we deliver our projects directly through the church, we have a huge network of clerical contacts on the ground all over the world. And this means that we're extremely well placed to provide clergy and benefactors and politicians and policymakers with accurate, up-to-date information on the threats, large or small, public or hidden, faced by Christian communities in pretty much every single country in the world. And it's from these contacts, ACN project partners and in-house regional experts, combined with personal experience from my own trips to ACN and information from friends and acquaintances of mine, mostly clergy and sisters from the Arab world, that I draw much of what I'd like to say this evening to you. So with much to say in relatively little time, I won't provide really anything about the history of Christianity in the part of the world we're looking at, but just suffice it to say, as you no doubt know, this region is the birthplace of 3 of the world's most influential religions, along with quite a few other faiths with smaller followings, but which are obviously no less worthy of our respect. The population is dominated by followers of Islam, though the region is extremely important also, both to Christianity and to Judaism. About half the world's oil reserves are held by nations in this part of the world. So we have extreme wealth, extreme poverty, complex local and regional histories involving, in some cases, quite a bit of European colonialist interference, rather a lot of political instability, a healthy dash of political corruption, and a number of fervently held and often opposing religious views. So all of this would make an exciting backdrop to any story. But the one I'll share this evening, though, may not at the moment be on course for a desperately happy ending. We shall see. The Arab world, as generally defined, stretches from the Arabian Peninsula through the Middle East, across North Africa, and down the African coast of the Red Sea. And it takes in about 20 countries. The vast majority of the population throughout the region, as I've said, is Muslim, but the worldwide Sunni-Shia balance, which is normally about 85% to about 10 to 12%, is thrown off by the larger concentration of Shia in countries like Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Syria, which of course stem from the neighboring non-Arab Iran. And the situation for Christians and other religious minority groups, including minority Muslims, varies quite a bit from country to country. Arguably, the worst case scenario can be found in Saudi Arabia, where there is no religious freedom of any kind. And this rebounds just as badly, if not worse, on the Shia community as it does on the very, very small number of Christians, which make up about 6% of the total population of 35 million people. Egypt has the largest numerical population of Christians in the region, but still at just over 16 million, it still remains considerably under 20% of Egypt's overall population, leaving this ancient and vibrant Christian community, the Copts, which is generally well educated and frequently better off and more likely to hold white-collar positions than other sectors of the Egyptian population. But they're subject to all manner of discrimination and more or less violent persecution, depending on the political leaning of the day or the whims of the local security forces or the community at large. A lot of Egyptian Christians live in rural areas, but there is quite a concentration in Cairo as well. The majority of the Christian population in some Arab countries is indigenous, and among these are Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine. And I suppose if you want to stretch it, you could say South Sudan at this point. While in other countries, the Christian population, which is often tiny, is made up almost entirely of workers of all levels of society, professional as well as blue-collar workers from elsewhere in the world. Generally, expat Christian communities are pretty much left alone, provided they make no outward show of their faith, provided they worship behind closed doors and avoid any communications which could be perceived as blasphemous or proselytizing. And you can make a bit of a separation, I think, between types of Christians here. I think very often Orthodox and Catholics is a little bit of a different, sometimes in some countries proselytizing equals telling someone that you're Christian. That's, good enough to get you in some trouble. But for other types of Christians, like free churches, for instance, proselytizing is really upfront. So I think there is a division sometimes between the types of Christians here. But it would be wrong, in any case, to say that in countries with native Christian populations, these citizens have achieved full equality. And threats from Islamic groups like Daesh, ISIS, or al-Nusra are always on the horizon. And at best, Christians and other religious minorities may be left to live peacefully, but in the knowledge that they're somehow less than others in the eyes of the law, of the security forces, of the political and social infrastructure. And in some ways, I would argue, this sort of soft persecution, the lack of progress in the workplace, second-rate education for one's children, unequal treatment under the law, and at times restricted access to medical or social support. We saw this a lot during COVID, with COVID lockdowns. And the expectation that another community's social and moral, mores will need to be followed. This sort of segregation, if you will, eats away at the human dignity of the religious and ethnic minority groups and can be even more disheartening and damaging in the long term than more obvious acute forms of persecution. But without a doubt, those Christians at greatest risk throughout the Arab world are those who have converted from Islam. For them exists a whole different world of sacrifice, a whole different level. And this can result in ostracism from family and the community at large, to pressure across a spectrum from house arrest, say, for teenagers or women who want to learn more about Christianity, to much more severe punishment for those, especially men, who convert to Christianity. And perhaps at this point, a few general comments on violations of religious freedom in our world today would provide some useful context. Christianity has the largest number of adherents, at 2.3 billion, or just over 30% of the world's population. Of this, only 1% now live in the Middle East and North Africa combined. Islam, which is currently at 25%, is the fastest growing religion and will overtake Christianity in the second half of this century should current demographic trends continue. The Pew report from 2021 saw instances of harassment of religious groups present in 190, this is really sad, 190 of 198 countries that they examined. Christians are harassed in one form or another in 53 countries. And the Arab world countries include the highest number of countries where Christians are struggling, 19 out of 20 in the region. Christians are harassed and persecuted in about 80% of all the countries, and more than any other group, although the Muslims are really not far behind here. And I think it's strange because on the one hand there are more Christians, but they're more spread out. So that explains why they actually are oppressed more than other religions. Just to be clear, religious oppression, ranging from soft discrimination all the way through violence and genocidal persecution, is by no means the sole purview of the world's Christians. Uyghur Muslims in China, Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar have been subjected to all manner of violent and cruel oppression. And the Hindus, as have the Hindus in Bangladesh and Pakistan, and the Baha'i are treated terribly in Iran, and I could go on. In fact, just the other evening, I heard Archbishop Anba Angelos, the Coptic Orthodox Bishop of London and the UK, make the point that at least in the Middle East, where Christians have suffered oppression and persecution, there are often smaller religious minorities, like the Yazidi, for instance, who've suffered far worse. And it's important to note this, if only to recognize that the Christian community, because of its size and its global influence, is at least in some measure protected when compared to the fate of adherents of smaller religions. Two recent reports, and these are admittedly by organizations focused specifically on violations of religious persecution against Christians, to highlight the ongoing situation in the Arab world as among the worst anywhere for those who follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. And in the New World Watch list from Open Doors, where they annually rank the top 50 countries where Christians are suffering, 12 out of the top 25 are in the Arab world, and 18 out of 20 countries in the region are included in the full list of 50. Less than a fortnight ago, ACN, my charity, launched its Persecuted and Forgotten report in the House of Lords. This report comes out every couple of years, and it focuses on the 24 or 25 countries that we recognize as those in which Christians are at greatest risk. 7 of these are in the Arab world, and since our last report in 2019, we judge that oppression and or persecution of Christians has increased in Qatar, in Syria, in Saudi Arabia, and in Sudan. They've remained the same, which is not great, in Palestine and Egypt, and slightly improved only in Iraq. ACN's Religious Freedom in the World report, which last appeared in 2021, is worth a look. It looks at all violations of religious freedoms against all faiths in every country in the world. And it includes every country in the Arab world, save for Palestine and Lebanon, on its list of countries with significant violations of religious freedom. And it includes all of these countries in either its red category, which is persecution, hate crimes, or religiously motivated violence, or its orange category, discrimination, hate crimes, and religious motivated violence. And it concludes that the situation is worse since 2018 in 11 Arab countries. It's the same in 2, and it improved in 4. And that is only equals 17. I know that, but I was looking at it on my phone, and 3 tiny countries must be in there as well, but I just couldn't see it on my phone. Sorry about that. Now, when I began to work for ACN in 2014, we were just a couple of months away from the banishment of Christians from the Nineveh Plains in northern Iraq. And by the end of August of that year, most of the region's ancient Christian communities had been abandoned by their inhabitants, and they, along with countless Muslims, Yazidis, and other minorities, had fled for their lives, primarily into the relative safety of Kurdistan, an autonomous state within Iraq. In Kurdistan, the UN set up camps for those who'd fled, but these were largely avoided by the Ninevan Christians. First, because they generally perceived that they were inhabited by those whom by whom they'd just been threatened, and later by families of ISIS, fighters. And the Yazidi also exhibited similar preferences and avoided the UN camps. The Kurdish Christians acted quickly, by which I mean 120,000 plus people pitched up in 48 hours. So they acted quickly to establish camps and trauma centers and to help those unable or unwilling to make use of what the UN had provided on the ground. And this is an interesting point because when it's particularly in Syria, it's the same problem there where Christians don't like to use UN camps. And countries very often farm out, when you decide you're going to take in Syrians, for instance, you farm out to the UN to help choose, who's coming. So when you have Christians who won't register with the UN to live in the camps, it means that that way of getting out through asylum to a country like the UK is cut off to them because they're not on the list. I visited Iraq in 2016, and I met many, many Christians who'd fled their villages in 2014. And I traveled with a group of MPs, and because of this, and it was unlike most ACN trips, which are populated mostly by ACN staff and bishops and priests, but this trip, I was there with a bunch of MPs. And this trip made us guests of the Iraqi government. So we had armed guards, and we were driven around in giant black people carriers by big burly men with black wires coming out of their ears. And I have to admit that I did wonder what these men employed by the Iraqi government, and almost certainly Muslims, what they thought of us and our visit. And at one point, we visited this, and I saw this most amazing thing. Sorry, this will only take a second, but it's really funny. We were driving, and I mean, had to be like 50, 60 miles an hour. They were always in a hurry. We're constantly pushing poor, men driving tiny lorries filled with chickens, off into the sand because they were always moving us in a big hurry. And they needed to switch shifts. So they had one people carrier coming this way at like 50 miles an hour, and I was in one with Neville going the other direction. And they actually stuck an arm out and handed a phone off to each other without ever slowing down. It was amazing. It's unbelievable. So anyway, we ended up at this monastery, which is in the north of the Nineveh Plains near a place called Al-Kosh. It's the monastery of Rabban Hormizd. And it's literally carved into the rock. This is the view, and you can just about see the cross up at the top over the Nineveh, watching over the Nineveh Plains. So we visited an ancient chapel inside the monastery, and our guides were with us. And this was the place where this 7th century monk, there was a hook in the ceiling and a sort of scratched image, and he would hang himself like this for hours on end to pray before this image. And I just wondered what they were thinking. And as we left the monastery precinct, one of the men looked at me and smiled, and he said, "That was a very amazing place." And I have to say, that it wasn't quite what I expected, so he rather enjoyed visiting it, which is very nice. I went to the camps in and around Ankawa, which is a largely Christian suburb of Erbil, and I met Christian families who, by that time, had been living for the better part of 2 years in shipping containers that had been turned into makeshift homes. And I would say they were about from the wall to here, and probably to the end of this room. That sound about right, Liam? There. And we were in them, and they were families. They're big, multi-generational Middle Eastern families. So 6, 7 children, and grandma, and the parents. It's a lot of people. And I visited families who couldn't all sleep at once. There just wasn't enough room. There weren't toilets. There weren't showers. They were cooking on camp stoves. They had jerry-built chapels, and they had more trailers. They're very industrious. So they had shops and bakeries and butchers and hairdressers. And there were children who were shipped off to local schools or taught outside by teachers who'd fled with them. And life wasn't easy for these people. Cramped spaces, no employment, growing resentment among the Kurdish Christians, because we need to remember that Kurds speak a different language, and they were already struggling economically before these over 100,000 Ninevan Christians and others pitched up in Kurdistan. So life was difficult. And in 2016, the Nineveh plain was still firmly under the control of ISIS. So there was no knowing how long this sort of Babylonian captivity was going to last. I'm sharing this with you because you need to know this background fully to understand how astounding it was that I found very little anger. They were shaken, yes, and traumatized, definitely, and baffled. But was their faith undermined? Absolutely not. Are you worried about the future? We asked again and again. And the answer was pretty much always the same. We are not afraid. We are Christians. We have hope. Things had changed when I went in 2018. That's when I went with Liam from the Bishops' Conference, who's here tonight. Mostly for the good, but there had been some sea change in attitudes as well. This time we were able to go into all the towns and villages you'll have heard about in the news. Karakosh, Teleskov, Karamlash, Bagdada, Batnaya. And I nearly got to Mosul, but Neville wouldn't let me. I was all set. I had a ride and everything, and he wouldn't let me go. This time I was there with a group of bishops and other clergy, but in a sense I felt safer than without our guard guides, because if you roll up to a checkpoint in an old car full of bishops, they just wave you through. It's only when you look all official they get worried. This time I met outright joyous people who had returned to their villages and homes that were sometimes in ruins, but who would drop everything, and I saw them do it, to attend Mass if they heard the church bells ringing. Anytime, day or night, the church was just packed. I met Gazella, who is that, you can see down in the bottom corner there. She's tiny, little elderly lady. Gazella is epic. She's a rock star. She was in her village on the Nineveh Plains in 2014 in August, and she and her friend, her sister-in-law Victoria, got up one morning to go to Mass, as they had for their entire lives. And they went to the church, and the door was locked. And they stood there for a minute, sort of baffled, and ISIS had come in the night, and everyone had fled, and they'd forgotten to take Gazella and Victoria. So ISIS soldiers pitch up, and they say, "Convert to Islam or we kill you." And Gazella said, "Do it." She's epic. And she said, "Bring it on." She said, "I'm Christian. I'm never going to ever turn my back on my God, and I am never going to convert. So if you want to shoot me, do it." And they were so taken aback by this that they just said, "Oh, just go away." So somehow they got themselves to Ankawa, which is where ACN first encountered Gazella. When I went, and did you meet Gazella? Yeah. We went into her house, and this will make me cry because she's ill. She has cancer, and there's no infrastructure. There's no hospitals or anything. So the parish and the parish priest are taking care of her. And she said she was so happy to be home. And Victoria is in Jordan with her son. And she said the only sad thing in her life is that she can't sit out in the sun with Victoria anymore in the afternoons. So say a prayer for Gazella tonight, if you have a chance. We visited families, and they were so happy to be home. But we also saw the devastation and the results of such anger and hatred on the part of those working with ISIS that it's almost too hard to describe the impression it made. Above Gazella is a picture of a cemetery in a village on the Nineveh Plains. I'm sorry that you can't see it better, but it's just wrecked. These people are never going to cause ISIS any problems. You know, it's just about completely erasing the ancient Christian heritage. But the awful thing for me was that there are those kind of equivalent of sort of Victorian wrought iron railings, right, around tombs. And they were bent. You know, I just can't. It would have taken so many angry men, really, really hate-filled people, to bend these. You know, it's not a thing that you can just kick over with your boot. And it was really, really, really upsetting to see the desecrated cemeteries in particular. And this is where we began to see anger on the part of some of those who were left picking up the pieces. The Dominican sisters in Karakosh, for instance, who've just recently opened a bunch of schools on the Nineveh Plains, they told me that they were struggling. They wanted to forgive, and they were struggling, and I hope they've found a way. I spent the night. Liam had to go stay in the hideous, I don't know what it was, a seminary or something, but Neville came out and said they haven't cleaned the toilets since, before ISIS invaded. It was gross. But I was there with one other woman, and we got to stay in the Dominican convent. So we had like a spa night while they were having this miserable thing. And the convent had been half destroyed by ISIS. It's an amazing story, actually. They bashed the altar. The sisters, when they left one one piece of consecrated host, and they just thought, they felt terrible leaving it behind, but they felt that that would keep Jesus there. And they came back, and it was still there. And they've glued the altar back together, but they only destroyed half the convent. So stupid Caroline, who can't stop herself from asking awkward questions when we're eating breakfast, I said, "Sisters, can you tell me why?" And they looked at each other and they said, "We knew you were going to ask." And they left all the bedrooms intact because that's where they raped the Yazidi women. And they said, "We know this because they left in such a hurry. They left their message board with how you sign out the runes." And so, this is what they were dealing with. So that's hard. Okay, so with over 50% of the Christian families back in their homes and more returning all the time, and with very positive outlook as a result of initiatives like the Catholic University in our bill, and the Pope's visit last summer in 2021, Christianity in Iraq feels like it's turned a bit of a corner. And in line with a number of sort of less hardline regional governments, the Iraqi government has within the past few years designated Christmas as a national public holiday and appointed Christians to some fairly important high offices. Is this enough? Well, we're still hearing about Shabak militias threatening Christian communities on the Nineveh Plains. And there's no getting around the fact that more than 80% of Iraq's Christians have fled since 2003, probably leaving no more, I'd say at the absolute most 150,000, which is less than 0.4% of the population of Iraq, which I think is about 42.5 million people now. Christians from the Nineveh Plains have been described as a double minority. They're among the very oldest Christian communities in the world, and they are native to the Nineveh Plains, but they're Assyrian, they speak Aramaic, and so they see themselves as both a religious and an ethnic minority. They may not consider themselves to be Arab, but the Iraqi government does, and I think in some ways that's lucky for them. Is it easy to be a Christian in Iraq today? No, I don't think so. Is there more work to be done and more support to be offered by people like us? Certainly. But despite the difficulties still facing the Christian population and the other minorities, things are looking up, and the future seems quite a bit brighter than it has in recent years. I wish I could say the same for Christians in Syria. Along with their Syrian brothers and sisters of other faiths, Christians in this beleaguered country have endured over a decade of civil war and the physical and emotional devastation and collapse of socio-political infrastructure that inevitably brings. But the ancient Christian communities in Syria, along with, obviously, other religious minority groups, including the Shia, have also had to cope with targeting by Islamic extremist groups like al-Nusra, for instance, groups that have within and without and alongside purely political activists have lobbed bombs and fired bullets and threatened and kidnapped and tortured and abused many Syrian Christians and others. Our project partners in Syria tell us now that the situation is in many ways worse than during the war. My friend's sister, Annie Demergen, who's there on the upper right-hand corner, spent the war looking after some of the most vulnerable Christians in Aleppo, and she's amazing. She's dodged bullets and ducked in doorways to avoid bombs while heading out each day to bring food and fuel and medicine and companionship to those most in need. Now, she says, people are less afraid of being killed, but that the poverty and lack of infrastructure are so bad that many people struggle to see how they can survive. And of course, with no fighting and with the religious extremist groups in the shadows for now, there are no news stories, which means there's much less support from outside of Syria. Christians used to make up about 10% of Syria's, I'll tell you about this drawing in a minute, about Syria's population of about 19.5 million. And estimates now suggest there are fewer than 650,000 remaining, or about 3.3%. Huge numbers of Syrians, including many Christians, along with many, many others of other faiths, can be counted among the over 5 million people who fled Syria since the onset of the civil war in 2011, which, according to the Syrian Observatory of Human Rights, which is based here in London, claimed up until 2021 over 600,000 lives. The UN gives a lower figure of around 350,000, but it does say that it's sure that that's an undercount of the actual total. The same period saw over 7 million Syrians living as IDPs, internally displaced persons, and a staggering 13.4 million in need of humanitarian aid. And the numbers continue to rise. In late January this year, nearly 50,000 more people were displaced because of armed conflict in and around Hisake in the northeast of the country. This drawing is part of a collection of drawings that ACN asked for children, from children of all faiths in Syria. When we look at Lebanon, it's the marginalized groups that suffer the most, both as a result of unfair treatment by governments and those holding powers, but also by members of majority communities who, suffering themselves, often search, perhaps understandably, for scapegoats on whom to assign blame or to vent their own anger and frustration. With prices in Syria, get ready for this, having risen as much as 800% since 2020, 90% of Syria's population now lives below the poverty line. And Sister Annie has told ACN that she regularly sees children looking for food in bins in Damascus and Aleppo. Unfortunately, this kind of hardship frequently invites a further deterioration of interfaith cooperation in parts of the world where such dialogue was already under threat. But those small kindnesses may yet be outnumbered by acts of cruelty and intolerance. There are many instances of kindness and cooperation, and these can shine a light on a different way forward. There is a fantastic soup kitchen in Aleppo where Christians and Muslims work together to serve hot meals to anyone in need. And then there's also the beautiful story of Father Jacques Mourad. Father Jacques rebuilt the monastery of Mer Elian in Karyatane in Syria. And he was a great friend of everyone's, of all faiths, of people who lived around this monastery. And he was kidnapped on the 21st of May in 2015 by religious extremists. And he was taken to Raqqa, where he was tortured and threatened with execution. I think he was gone for about 6 months. Eventually, he was taken to Palmyra to discover that 250 of his parishioners had also been kidnapped. But they were put under so much pressure by the local Muslim community to return them that they were returned, and they were put under house arrest, and they stayed in the monastery. And from the very first night, the local Muslim families brought them food and helped them. And then over time, Father Jacques got very worried about the young Christian girls and young women, that they would be taken away and forcibly converted and forced to marry. So the Muslim families dressed them up in the local sort of garb of women and took them out, smuggled them out to safe places. And then when Father Jacques realized his days were numbered and he had to go, a Muslim friend of his dressed him up as a Bedouin, put him on the back of his motorbike and drove him out of town. And, that's the sort of story that we need to hold on to and we need to hear more about. And when I read there's a report, he's called Jacques Mourad, if you want to read more about him, but I was reading one of the articles of someone who interviewed him, and she said, "Why did they help you?" And Father Jacques said, "It's simple. They said that we were their family, and they lived together, and that's the kind of thing, as I say, that we need to grab onto. And that's Father Jacques. And that's what's the monastery, which I think is largely destroyed. And he's now in Iraq, in Solmania, in Kurdistan, I think. Right, now I just want quickly to talk to you just briefly about Egypt. As I said earlier, Egypt boasts the largest number of Christians in the region, and the situation is precarious in a different way. Egyptian Christians, or Copts, live essentially as second-rate citizens. The Egyptian constitution declares they're free to worship and live their faith as they see fit, but the reality is a bit different. Christian communities are regularly targeted both to damage their place of worship, but also in various social and legal and political contexts, all of which create an atmosphere of interreligious tension, intolerance, and a lack of respect. Kidnappings, especially among young Christian girls and women, continue to be a big problem in Egypt. These girls and women are often sexually abused. They can be made to marry, usually much older Muslim men, and forced to convert to Islam against their will. We regularly receive reports that the local police, security forces, and legal and political representatives provide little help much of the time, and when they do, it's too late to make a difference. Worst case scenarios, I've read, include parents of kidnapped Christian girls knowing who took their daughters and where they are, and still receiving no support from the local police, who at times themselves also know the location of the abducted young person. The Copts certainly need our compassion and our prayers, but I'd like to interject here a very brief story that underscores the point that there is a deep and very moving faith among these beleaguered and persecuted Christians. Shortly after I joined ACN, I had the privilege of meeting Bishop Kyrillos William, who's there in the slide. He's the Coptic Catholic Bishop of Asyut. He's a Bishop Emeritus now, he's retired. And he said something to me that I've never, ever forgotten. I asked him how he found the strength to cope with the pressures and distress of supporting his flock in a part of the world where Christians were under threat. And his answer, he had this little beatific smile, and he said, "Caroline, I am a bishop of a persecuted church, and my churches are full." So perhaps here also, I should add a recently made point by Archbishop Angelos. He said just Wednesday, on Red Wednesday, he said, because of the large size of the Christian community in Egypt, he argues that Copts are subjected in a way to a more coordinated and carefully concerted plan of persecution by Islamic extremists, because to rid Egypt of the large Coptic population would be to deal the worst possible blow numerically to Christianity throughout the whole region. I know that I just wanted also to mention briefly here that in Iraq and Syria, and I imagine other parts of the world, Arab or otherwise, where Christian communities are under threat, aside from their churches being full, we've also seen something really wonderful occur between clerics of different rites. And as you can imagine, there for centuries, can be very standoffish. But I can remember meeting the Patriarch of Damascus 7 or 8 years ago, and I asked, how are you getting on, with the other rites? And he said, bomb goes off, I wait, we have a phone chain. He said who's going to pick me up to come and take me? Whose turn is it to drive to where the bomb went off? And also Archbishop Nicodemus, who's the Syrian Orthodox Archbishop of Mosul, was given a house and shelter by the Chaldean Archbishop of Erbil. So in a funny way, this sort of persecution has made the Christian rights work together where they needed to. I just wanted to finish up very quickly with Lebanon. I've just been there, and I know this is another anecdotal story, but I was there earlier this year in April, I think. Until recently, Lebanon was the only Middle Eastern country with a Christian majority. And it was a regional center for finance and commerce with large numbers of white-collar workers and relatively high levels of educational attainment. It was prosperous and cosmopolitan. I don't know if anyone's ever been there, but much of Beirut has a very decidedly European feel to it. Maronites, or Lebanese Catholics, and other Catholic rites provided much of the best education in Lebanon. So many Muslims opted for Catholic education for their children, and this, along with the religious equality written into Lebanon's constitution, led to a society where Christians, Sunni, Shia, and other religious minorities, for the most part, rub along very well together. Christians were and are seen as the bridge builders between Shia and Sunni communities, and the friendships formed and respect born of growing up and attending school together, I think, have largely prevented the rise of Islamic extremism that has wreaked such havoc in neighboring countries like Syria and Iraq. However, political corruption, extremely high risk international dealings, financial dealings, the arrival of, the official figure is about 1.5 million, but it's a lot more than that, and likely many, many more refugees from Syria and Iraq, are just the high points of a long list of the total reasons for the total dysfunction of Lebanon's infrastructure and the virtual collapse of its economy. The huge explosion in the port of Beirut, which is adjacent, by the way, to some of the poorest Christian neighborhoods in the city, was just another terrible blow to this small but once stable and prosperous nation. At least 60% of Lebanon's population lives below the poverty line, and the UN is now estimating more like 80%. And it's closer to 90% among refugees and among the poorest native communities, many of which are Christian. The currency's lost 90% of its value in the last couple of years, and for the last 2 years, I think Lebanon has had the highest inflation levels in the world. It's overtaken Venezuela. After my 2 really faith-enriching trips to Iraq, I was looking forward to visiting some ACN projects in Lebanon. This was just after lockdown. And I wanted to meet more Christians who would share their stories of their hardship, but their hopes for the future. We didn't visit the refugees in the Bekaa Valley, but we visited native Lebanese Christian projects we support, and what I saw and heard there truly, truly shocked me. I met people whose suffering is great and who can see no way out. They're not worried about bombs or invasion, but they're facing grinding poverty with no prospect of employment, lack of affordable education, lack of affordable medical services, and what's worse, the Christians in Lebanon, from some of the oldest Christian communities in the world, see no way out, and it is truly heartbreaking. I met Dimi there in the upper left-hand corner with her daughter Princess in Borj Hamoud. It's a very poor Christian neighborhood in Beirut. She's still breastfeeding Princess because there's no money to buy milk, and baby formula is very hard to come by. I visited a psychiatric hospital where there's almost no medical staff left, but where the sisters and the nurses and a handful of dedicated doctors, a mixture of Christian and Muslim staff, they've told us that they would take the patients into their own homes if they were forced to close, because these are people who have been abandoned by their families and who definitely couldn't live on their own. You can see this boy in the back there, and he's catatonic, and he sits like this, and then every once in a while, it was beautiful. A nurse or a doctor would walk by and, stroke his cheek and move his arms this way. And it was a lovely thing to see. I thought this little boy and the cheeky man with a grin who put his collar up and did Elvis impressions in the men's ward, he was ace, I thought that was going to be the most heartbreaking thing, but I was wrong. The worst part was when I went to the university chaplaincy, the Catholic chaplaincy, that's run by a Jesuit. And that was the hardest part, because I met young people in their 20s. I have 3 children in their 20s. And with tears streaming down their faces, they told us they had no prospects. They had no hope of a future as Christians in Lebanon. And that was the most upsetting thing of my trip. They're bright, educated, articulate young people with their whole lives before them, and they love their country, and they love their communities and their families, and their faith is strong. But the political corruption, the economic collapse, the shift away from genuine interfaith cooperation towards the softest and most invidious types of discrimination, these are why we're told that 90% of Lebanon's young Christians want to leave, 50% will go, and the remaining 40 lack the money or connections to go straight away, but they will go as they can, and they won't be back because they're in their 20s, so they'll go off, they'll have careers, they'll settle down, they'll have families, they'll have mortgages. So it's drawing a line under it. There are, of course, absolutely many young Lebanese Muslims who have a similar story to tell. Another thing they mentioned was that they felt that it would take it's very sectarian, all the politics in Lebanon, and that they felt it would take 2 or 3 election cycles, even if somebody could come up with a way to come up with parties that were less sectarian, it would be too long for them. There are lots and lots of young Lebanese Muslims who'd say the same thing. But I do think we need to remember that the majority of the Lebanese diaspora, which can be as high, it was just over 4 million people in Lebanon before all the refugees pitched up, so now it's more like 7 million. But the Lebanese diaspora might be as high as 14 million, and the majority of that, and I've read sources that say they think it's up to 85% of it is Christian. So that suggests that Lebanon's ancient Christian communities, despite the multi-faith constitution and their traditionally high levels of religious cooperation, have still failed to see a future for themselves and their families within Lebanon. I felt perfectly safe there, so it's not about bombs and guns, but it's no less a battle of the very survival of these communities. Now, my time's nearly at an end, and I realize I haven't touched on most of the countries where the Christian population is really small and non-native. But I just thought it was best to focus on the countries where ACN's working the most. And I want to close by recognizing that there are, like in Father Jacques Mourad's story, there are glimpses of a world of greater acceptance and something more than just tolerance for Christians and other religious minorities, including other branches of Islam in the Arab world. We're seeing nods by governments that may indicate a greater acceptance of the rights of indigenous Christian communities. As I said earlier, often the expat communities are given a bit more rope to live out their faiths as long as they don't do anything outward. In 2014, the King of Bahrain donated the land. It's just opened this cathedral for the new Catholic Cathedral of Our Lady of Arabia, just outside the capital, Manama. And it was also in Bahrain in 1939 that the first Catholic church in the Gulf states was open. I already mentioned the recognition of Christmas as a public holiday in Iraq. Egypt has allowed the construction of new Christian churches since 2020, although I think it's quite mired in bureaucracy, so I'm not sure it's made much difference in reality. And the UAE has helped to fund restoration of Christian heritage sites in Iraq that were damaged and destroyed by ISIS. And while these don't entirely make up for the facts that a religious freedom remains largely unenforced, even in those Arab countries whose constitutions state that all have the right to practice their faith, or that Christians or other religious minorities are legally seen as second-class citizens, or that those people who choose to convert from Islam to another religion often don't feel safe enough to remain in their own countries. But these concessions are certainly part of and are indeed heartily welcomed by the native Christian communities and deserving of respect from those of us looking on. I think there's reason to begin to see a groundswell of respect and understanding here within individual communities of all faiths within the Arab world. I just wanted to end with just very quickly, these are, up in the corner there, you see this football league. This is one of my favorite interfaith projects we support. It's the All Pakistan Don Bosco Football League. And it's an annual tournament where people of all faiths come and they're divided up into teams together. And by playing football together, they realize that people whose faith is different from their own are not scary, they're not different. They learn to play together. So I really love the Football League. And the man standing in the left corner is Father Eduardo Roca. He's in Mozambique. He works in the city, in a Muslim slum in the city of Pemba. And ACN gave him some money to rebuild his church. Because to build a church, because they didn't have enough room and his community was growing and growing and growing. But he sent us a letter when he received the money explaining what this meant to him. And at the end, he says that we needed this space, and thank you so much. But he says, and these are his words, even though the fact that we need space to build this church is important for me, and I'm quoting him, it's not the main reason. Those who convinced me the most are the other brothers, the Muslims. At present, many of them approach our chapel, enter the enclosure, and they're not afraid. Fear and prejudice are the worst threats to peace. In almost 10 years that I have been here in Mahate in Mozambique, one of my greatest concerns has been the search for a place in which we can meet, acknowledge each other, and engage in dialogue. Imams have been coming here lately, and I see with gratitude nowadays they feel confident at a time when it's so easy to stigmatize. The church that is rising bears witness to the encounter, to the unconditional acceptance and dialogue. And what ACN has given us means that the whole neighborhood can scent the gospel's good fragrance. And many of those who pray in the 7 mosques around us can smell it too. They know that this house is open, that it heals wounds, it accompanies, and it takes care. And that too smells good. And just one more thing, and I'll be done. I'm American. I'm a big fan of Eleanor Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt, you will know, chaired the commission that constructed the UN Declaration of Human Rights, of which Article 18 focuses on the right of all to practice their faith peacefully. And on the 10th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights. She summed up why the rights and freedoms in the Declaration are so important. And this, to me, is the lesson for us all to take away. And I quote the former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, "Where, after all, do human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. And unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world." Thank you very much. Thank you.